This week's episode of Pathfinder is brought to you by SpiderOak. SpiderOak's Orbit Secure software is designed for hybrid space operators struggling to manage the chaos of securing data flow and access to and from tens of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. Using a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, Orbit Secure allows your mission to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-Orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure hybrid space environments. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload. It's our last episode of the year, so we're going to do something extra special. I have Payload's entire editorial team in the hot seat this week. We're going to do a recap of 2023. A lot has happened, and we're going to go through our top stories and trends of the year and end with some predictions. Now, footnote, I got to say from the very beginning, we're likely not going to be able to get to everything, but you can read most of it on our website and newsletter this week. So with us today, we have Jacqueline Felcher, managing editor, Rachael Zisk, lead reporter, and Jack Kerr, our research director. So guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mo.
Thanks for having us.
So to start, let's maybe do a quick round robin, 2-minute introductions, who you are and how you got to Payload. So I will start with who has been at the company the longest, which is Rachael. So Rachael, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's me. Strangely enough, Payload's longest tenured employee at this point. I have been with Payload since we launched the daily newsletter 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago. It was November of 2021. And before that, I've been a journalist. I went to journalism school. Before Payload, I had been writing about a variety of topics in business and in science. I had done an internship for the Financial Times, and I had been for Popular Science, both as an intern and freelance. RIP, the Popular Science magazine. It's a new loss, but and
wait, is Popular Science? Did Popular Science shut down?
The magazine shut down. Yeah, recently. They laid off most of their editorial staff, not all, and they had ended the print magazine. I actually had no idea. That is very sad. I want to say about a year ago, and then it is no longer. I know, it's sad. I grew up with that, reading Popular Science and a few other ones that have been losses this year.
I had a subscription to Popular Science for 5 or 6 years. I used to love getting it. So that's actually quite sad.
I know, it's sad.
It was very sad.
It was that one, and it was when National Geographic laid off their editorial staff, their in-house editorial staff. Those were some sad ones this year. It's been a rough year for media. We can talk about that, but luckily, Payload is doing great. When I found Payload, I was working actually in public communications. I was doing genomics writing for the National Institutes of Health. Stumbled across this cool new startup doing space stuff and never looked back. That's where I'm at.
Had you always been interested in space?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in it. I'd never covered it as my main beat. I had studied journalism, gotten into science stuff, covered it. I think I covered the OSIRIS-REx sampling when that happened, and I thought that was really cool. I covered a few other space stories here and there, but it had always been something that I was just kind of more casually interested in. I was never, a huge buff. So it's been quite the learning curve over the past 2 years, learning the industry and the ins and outs. And, it's still something that I'm learning every day. But I think I have a better grasp on it now than maybe I did 2 years ago.
Great. All right, Jacqueline, you're up next.
Great. So I have been with Payload for a little over a year. I started in October of 2022. Before that, I was at Defense One covering kind of big national security policy. My real start in space journalism came before that when I was at Politico. I helped launch their weekly space policy newsletter. And before that, I had a couple different jobs around DC covering Capitol Hill and the Pentagon. So I've been in DC for 12 years now, which is crazy. We're reaching the point that this is the longest I've lived anywhere. It's about to eclipse like the town I grew up in as the longest I've lived anywhere. So yeah, love covering politics and policy. I came to Payload. Ari's, well known for his payload hat. I spotted him in his payload hat out at Space Symposium, and I was a subscriber. I was a fan, so I stopped him and started chatting with him. And 6 months later, I was working here. So it was a very fortuitous turn of events that I happened to cross paths with him that day. And yeah, as managing editor, I oversee all the editorial stuff, so all of our newsletters, and keep the trains running on time in the newsroom.
Amazing. And then last but not least, Jack.
Thank you. So I joined Payload about a year ago or 9 months ago. My background is a bit different from Rachael and Jacqueline's and other reporters. Before joining the reporting world, I worked in New York for a number of years in finance, covering aerospace acquisitions, leverage finance, really dealing with private equity acquisitions. And with that, particularly probably starting in 2020, we started seeing, my company Ally started seeing more pure play space businesses. And I've always been a space nerd and followed the industry to a certain extent, but love the combination of the business aspect of it and also just space's cool aspect of it. So yeah, anyways, then after that, I transitioned to Payload. And actually, I do think the business background, particularly because Payload does cover a lot of startups and more of the business side. We also cover the policy side, but a lot of the business side of space, that it gives my perspective coming from a finance background, gives me a lot of unique thoughts or thoughts on what makes a business good or bad and how to concisely write them. You came from a finance background as well, but there's definitely a lot of parallels with writing investment memos, breaking down a business, summarizing a business, and kind of drawing out the key points and risks and educating people on it. So yeah, so I've been writing now for almost a year at Payload, and loved working with Jacqueline and Rachael too.
Yeah, and I think you have the largest Twitter followers amongst the four of us. If I'm not, or X followers, if I'm not mistaken. Wait, is it or Jacqueline? Do you have more? Actually,
that's definitely not true. I think Jacqueline's so mad.
Jacqueline, how many do you have?
I would say.
I think Jack, you have like 3,000 or something.
11,000.
I'm currently posting the most
definitely not
on it, but Ari probably takes the cake on that, anyways. But he's more of a LinkedIn guy now.
Yeah, he is a LinkedIn guy. Oh no, actually, Jacqueline, you are Jacqueline. No, you're well in the lead. You're at 11,000. Sorry to scare you there. Sorry to scare you. Okay, so
really?
So I have a lot of stories I want to chat about, but I want to give you guys the floor first. Right, you're the editorial staff. You guys are really helping. You write the newsletter every day. It's certainly not me, and you've done an amazing job building, one of the leading publications for the industry. So big hat off and kudos to you guys. So I want to ask you, like, what are some of the more interesting, or maybe like let's go around the room. Each person can maybe highlight what was their top story of the year in terms of like what they thought was most important or what they were most interested in writing about or excited about. So let's start there and then we'll go from there. So Jack, why don't we start with you?
Well, I would say we obviously cover a lot of niche startups, but Starship has dominated headlines, and I think for good reason. It's been a big year for SpaceX and Starship, but I think for the sake of this podcast, I think we can have some interesting discussions with Rachael and Jacqueline as well on developments over in South Texas.
Yeah, so you're going with Starship. That's very fair. It also I think your Starship pieces have been the most read and more engaged with pieces that we have. So clearly, from a readership perspective, that's what seems to capture people's eyes and attentions particularly. But actually, I'm gonna ask to pause on Starship because we're gonna get into that in a little bit, and there's a lot that we can talk about there. So let's pause on Starship and come back to it. So Jacqueline, I'll kick it over to you next.
So I think my favorite story that I wrote this year, but also like a bigger theme that I was tracking out of DC. I talked to NASA Administrator Bill Nelson about his large number of international trips. And he had some really interesting things to share that like when he travels overseas, he's not just meeting with space leaders, like prime ministers want to meet with the US NASA chief. And, when I asked him, well, what do you do when you're meeting with these South American countries and China comes up? He's like, I've been a senator for a long time. I engage with them. So looking at, Nelson as like not just the NASA chief, but as kind of America's space diplomat, both meeting with officials in DC. He just got back from a trip to India where he's like brokering deals. And I thought it was so interesting that I think it's a role that we haven't necessarily seen all NASA administrators fill, but he's obviously had this long career in government. He's flown to space, this very storied career. I thought it was like a really interesting look at the soft power opportunities of space and the ways that kind of consensus about space can bridge the conversation to kind of more sticky conversations about not space topics. So that, plus Nelson is just such a talker. That was one of my favorite stories that I did this year.
Yeah, and it's like also like a bit reflective of what's going on now, right? Because back in the 60s, there were, two space programs, the US and the Soviets. Today, there's something close to 80. There's 16 nations that can actually launch things into space independently. So, I agree with you completely. It does highlight the larger trend of how accessible and, for lack of a better word, democratized space has gotten.
I think on that, his most recent trip was to India, and the ISRO, the Indian Space Agency, this year has done some really, really amazing things, and has been one of the most impressive stories, I think, of this year. I mean, they're doing like more commercial launches and also landing an uncrewed spacecraft on the moon is, as we all know, a very impressive feat. So I think the emergence of them has been just like a bright spot to kind of add to the addition of China, Russia, and the U.S.
Yeah. Jack, you're beating me to the punch for my favorite space story of the year, which was the Chandrayaan 3 lunar landing. And I really think that, first of all, super exciting just in general, humanity's grand return to the moon. And I think that this is indicative of a trend that we're going to see in the coming years as we attempt to establish a more long-term lunar presence, both with robots and then, later on with people. It's exciting to see India emerge as a space power, and it's exciting to kind of get another craft back on the moon as, a whole bunch of commercial programs are also hoping and planning to land their own crafts very, very soon, potentially, within a month or two.
And we were actually supposed to have the first private company land or attempt a landing on the moon, but Intuitive Machines, of course, which was supposed to land in the summer, but now it looks like it's going to be more like January, February. But 2023 in some ways was going to be a big year for the moon, but I guess we'll have to wait till 24.
Yeah, and we also had the Hakuto R lander, which crash landed on the moon this year, which was not as bright a spot as the Chandrayaan 3 launch, which could have the iSpace lander could have been the first commercial landing, but that just goes to show how tough it is, and what a big challenge these companies are undertaking when they fly these missions.
So, Rachel, I have a question for you. And I know, caveat, obviously, none of us here are engineers, but you are the writer of Parallax, our science publication that comes out weekly. Why do you think it's so hard, even after all these years and experience of landing on the moon? Why is it still so difficult to land safely on the moon? What do you think?
Oh, man. I mean, yes, I'm not an engineer, so I can't speak to the specific challenges, but I think the part of it is that we're just trying to do different things now than we've done with lunar landers in the past. We're trying to land in different areas. We're taking different approaches. We're using different, thruster technology. It's still in some ways uncharted waters. And so while I can't speak to the, specifics of why, with iSpace's lander, it was an altimeter glitch. They, went over a cliff and didn't realize. There's just all these like little issues when it comes to the terrain and the technology and the ways that we're trying to accomplish these feats that is new and that we're still trying to overcome. I don't know if anybody else has a more specific answer to that.
There's like a million craters on the moon, there's legitimately a million craters on the moon, and there's no atmosphere to just deploy a parachute. So it's a much different landing process where you need thrusters to land in. So and do that uniquely. In a way, it's like we talk about everything is moved to autopilot, but in a way, the moon is a environment that is probably still something that humans can be better at landing on, as they can like quickly adjust to, as we saw in the Apollo missions, as they can quickly adjust to the environment as it comes up, because there's just a lot of variables.
I also think there's like a different level of risk acceptance and different expectation than there was in the 60s. I feel like in the 60s, obviously no one wants to risk human life, but at the same time, I do think people were going to the moon is experimental, and people sort of expected it not to work and then were pleasantly surprised when it did, versus I think people were surprised when iSpace crashed to the moon because so much does work consistently. There's just sort of the expectation that this stuff will work, and then when it doesn't, it's a surprise, versus decades ago, I think no one expected any of this to work, and it was a surprise when it did.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. All right, so let's talk about an area of the space industry that is probably the most talked about area of the space industry, which is launch. SpaceX has launched, I think, now 93 times this year. They're aiming to get to 100. I don't know if they'll get there, but I think they'll get very, very close if they don't get there. Obviously, that's great, and it's been huge for the industry and has supported so many different companies and business models and governments. But there seems to be a consensus, at least that I am hearing, that governments and commercial customers are desperately seeking alternatives, especially in the medium and heavy size class. And if you look at the medium and heavy size class, there's been long delays, like Vulcan, Ariane 6, Vega C. Now, and part of the outcome of that is that Starlink competitors, for example, are having to rely on SpaceX, right? So, what do you think? What are you seeing? What do you think is happening? What do you think the implications of all this is? I know you guys have covered a lot of these businesses and a lot of these stories for this year.
I have a couple thoughts on it. One, there's certainly a shortage of launch. That doesn't mean that there is a decrease year over year of launch. It just means SpaceX is launching more and more vehicles, and a lot of that is Starlink dedicated launches. I think as I talk to the satellite operators and startups who are looking to get their first birds into space, I think there's availability out there. It's just the terms are very tight, and there's no wiggle room. And it's okay, if you're manifested on launch next year, you better have that satellite ready to go. And there's alternatives, but it's you kind of have to have your stuff together. I think we talked about the shortage this year, but I think it also just sets up for a really special year next year. You mentioned all these heavy lift rockets coming online. You have Ariane 6 and Vulcan, which is going to be, I think, pretty prolific. prolific. New Glen is coming online next year. And I think these are legitimate next years, not just like we'll talk about it and then do it in 2025. So that might have been the story, that this launch shortage might have been the storage next year, but there is we're very, very close to capacity coming online.
Yeah, I think the geopolitical.
So
sorry, go ahead, Jacqueline.
I was going to say, can I take the moderator privilege for a second and ask a question?
You may take that. You may take the privilege.
You mentioned those 3 rockets coming online. Like, do you think once they're online and they're not delayed anymore, that will be enough to fill the shortfall? Or do you think there'll still be a gap in capacity even with those and like actually flying?
That's a really good question. I think let's just assume all of those are come online next year. I think that, well, that's a great question. I don't know. If I was guessing, I would say I think we would still see a shortage next year. And I think we would still see pent up demand because most of these vehicles are going to take, a couple launches before they get into a cadence that they're like, launching more regularly. So my thought would be like 2025 is the year where you probably have a little bit more normalization in capacity in both supply side and demand side. So that would be my guess, but I don't know. It's a great question.
Yeah, I think also what happens, I mean, a lot of the demand is coming from the small sats and the smaller operators. And does a Vulcan, I don't know the answer to the question. Is there some sort of like transporter type, rideshare type missions that are going to be offered? That's not just the transporter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Yeah, no, it's look, I think rideshare, it's obvious that rideshare is a huge part of these business models, whether they're profitable or not. We've gone down that road a number of times. That's a whole different question. But it's a fair point. But with that, let's talk Starship. So Starship had their second flight test. They had their second flight test, and it went great. It was really exciting. Ultimately, the question of success or failure is one for debate, for sure. But one thing we can say for sure is that there were a significant amount of technical milestones that were achieved and reached. And I think in general, for the industry at large, it was a huge moment, huge day. But the question I have for you guys is, why do you think the mainstream media reaction around Starship was leaning so negative? And what I mean by that is if you actually looked at a lot of the headlines use the F word a lot. And by F word, I mean failure. It also talked about how, the rocket blew up. Like a lot of the headlines were, around like, this SpaceX rocket blows up. What do you think is happening? Why do you think the headlines were the way they were and the stories were written in the way they were, which was supposed to be, supposed to be a huge moment for the industry?
I mean, truthfully, I don't think that those headlines were wrong, literally speaking. I think if you're looking at what the mission objectives for that second flight test were, they wanted to send Starship all the way around the world. They wanted to, they didn't want the booster to explode on its way down to a water landing or splash down in the water. Literally speaking, if you are a journalist who maybe isn't super well versed in the space industry, you look at this flight test and you see an explosion. And reporting that there was an explosion is honestly, it's the correct thing to report. I think that mainstream media has, I guess there's somewhat of a misunderstanding of what constitutes failure and success in space. Just that these incremental increases in ability are so important as you're building new space technology. And with Starship, the second flight test did notch so many new successes. But also, I think that mainstream media doesn't have the privilege that we here at Payload have, that our audience is also so well versed. You have to kind of, as a mainstream media publication, write the news that your audience is going to understand, that is going to be somewhat useful for them from whatever perspective you're coming from. Here at Payload, we have an audience of industry members and policymakers and investors who understand the space industry a little bit better. And so when we say that, the Payload headline was that the test ended in loss. I know that because I wrote it. And it did. But when you send that to an industry audience, they read the story and it goes into the successes that were notched during this flight and some of the details and nuance of the flight itself and what was achieved. And I don't think that mainstream media that doesn't have a space-focused audience has that privilege.
I think that's fair. I think that's all fair. Jacqueline, do you guys agree?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Rachel is totally right that the rocket did blow up. So it's fair to say that. But I do think, the headlines to me looked pretty similar from the first test to the second test. And there's a lot of nuance there missing. Yes, the rocket blew up in both of them, but they accomplished so much more on the second test. Like the launch pad wasn't destroyed and the rocket made it so much further. And I do think, while they're obviously accurate, I do think there's a lot of nuance lost there.
Yeah, I think we, covering the space industry, we cover engineering and incremental advances. Like a space takes 10 years for an outcome to happen. And we love covering those incremental engineering nuances, and our audience loves it as well. But if you go even a layer back, even if you go into a layer further away from the space industry and just talk about like hardcore techies or just general engineers, they probably know what the Falcon 9 rocket is, but maybe they don't know that's a 2-stage rocket, or they don't know that it like lands, the booster re-lands. And those are those are like tech people. And I think it's probably important for us to remember that to some degree in our writing and in the nuance of being space reporters. But then if you go like a whole layer back and you go into the mainstream media past the techie stage, then I think people are looking at just the outcomes. It's like when you get on a plane, you want it to go from Dallas to New York, and that's all you care about. You don't care about the engineering behind the airplane or whatnot. You just care about getting there. And when I think a regular or mainstream, quote unquote mainstream reporter would report on this, the outcome was supposed to be getting a rocket is supposed to go to space, and that didn't happen. And that's what their audience, I guess, wants to know and what they're covering.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And I think ultimately, it's funny. I still am shocked when I talk to folks that are not in the industry, just like friends or friends of friends or folks I meet at different, social gatherings that I'm getting to know. And, obviously I love talking about space. So space comes up naturally or sometimes not naturally. And but I am truly surprised by how many people actually don't know what Starship is. Like they just don't know. They're like, what's Starship? Or the fact that it launched, literally no idea. It's fair. I think everyone's perspective here is correct, which is like, at the end of the day, like you're talking about a lot of an audience that actually, to your point, Jack, just kind of cares ultimately about what that outcome is and not what it's creating. So, okay. So let's talk markets in general before we move on to more policy related news. So the S&P 500, which is the broad market, is up about 24% over the last year. Aerospace and defense, like an index of aerospace and defense companies, which are primarily the primes, is up about 21%. Space companies, however, are only up 5%. So, Jack, actually, let me ask you this question, because I know you spend a lot of time on the public space companies and you spend a lot of time on the SPACs. And I'm going to ask you about the chart that you just made that is very interesting. But do you think the market is missing something, or do you think the market is spot on where the space companies should be trading? And what's your kind of general take on valuations?
Yeah, I mean, we had last year was a brutal year for the SPACs. I would imagine if you want to just talk SPACs and not even the broader space index of if you don't even include Viasat and whatever, just talk about the SPAC companies, you probably have even more of a downward trend than those stats that you just mentioned. But I think what's particularly painful for space investors is maybe not even comparing it to A&D. If you compare it to like Cathie Wood's ARC index, I mean that's up 60% this year, and you see like high beta risky companies do very well this year, but the space companies are not. And I think there's a maybe a come to Jesus moment that's happening where investors are fundamentally questioning business models, where it's not just a matter of like how much cash they need to get to revenue. It's is this just going to be a cash guzzler indefinitely? And if you look at the cash balances, they are dwindling, and free cash flow is not it's not doing much better than it was last year. And these are, I mean, that's to be expected. These are you can call these deep tech companies. These are R&D companies. It's a reason why SPACs didn't really exist before SPACs existed. Is generally you have the VC markets to fund these type of companies rather than like a very public fund.
Yeah. And I think the other lesson learned is that the public markets are not a place where you conduct R&D. It's just not, because if you try to do that, you will get burned. And biotech is a great example. Biotech is actually the only area of the market that I think like is used to the idea of like accepting R&D risk and then having binary outcomes. But space is not that. And I think that we don't need to belabor the point, but I think you're absolutely right. Now, I do want to talk very quickly. So you did do a really interesting table the other day, which we haven't published, I don't think, Jack. Right?
No,
right? We haven't. So we'll do a little preview, but basically, Jack put together a really cool table of like all of the public or a number of this public space companies that SPAC'd, and basically looked at their cash burn profile over the last 9 months, and basically assumed what that average cash burn is, and effectively looked at their cash balances and said, how much more cash do they have left before either they need money or they will go out of business. So, Jack, you don't need to name names specifically, but what was your conclusion after doing that analysis?
I think it's gonna when we do publish it next week, I think it's going to be very helpful to the industry just to have it all aggregated in one place, so people can just see it, right? Everyone kind of knows that cash is a problem, but just to see it on a chart, I think is very helpful for people. And yeah, I told you I came from a finance background. It wasn't VC, it was PE, where cash is important, where credit is important, where cash flow means something. And even in like high growth businesses, cash is still king, and you don't need revenue, but you need cash on the balance sheet to survive. And it's important. It's important even for CFOs of high growth companies to know that.
Yeah, all fair points. Okay, well, this is great, but we got to take a very quick break. And when we get back, we're going to talk Jacqueline's favorite topic, which is all things policy. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. To quote the commander of the U.S. Space Force's Operations Command, cyber threats are unfortunately the soft underbelly of our global space networks. SpiderOak, the leader in space cybersecurity software, is dedicated to providing space operators with the solutions they need to protect hybrid space systems. Their Orbit Secure software uses a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, allowing missions to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure LEO and hybrid space systems. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Okay, so welcome back. Now, Jacqueline, I'm going to turn over the car keys to you. And I know you have a number of stories you want to talk about as it relates to policy. And I think what was the biggest, the biggest stories within, policy, government, military news that you've been covering this year. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things, and it's something that Jack has covered a lot for us too, is seeing kind of the buildup of the Artemis Accords versus the buildup of China's ILRS coalition. You're really, I mean, we could do a whole podcast debating, are we in a space race with China? But you're seeing, this kind of two-pronged approach. And over the course of 2023, we saw both coalitions grow pretty substantially. So the Artemis Accords have more than 30 signatories now, and 8 of them came this year. And it's really cool to see, African nations joining. And I know I talked with a State Department official who was, talking about the benefits of even non-spacefaring nations joining these. So you're seeing that coalition grow. ILRS, which is the Chinese, joint Chinese-Russia, but primarily led by China, their moon base program. So it's much smaller. They have fewer than 10 partners total, but 5 of them came this year. So it's really gaining momentum, and it's just really interesting to see, countries kind of stake a claim on one side or the other. And to be clear, the US has said it's not us versus China. Like, I don't think NASA views this as a competition with China, but it's interesting to see kind of what benefits each side offer and how different countries are kind of throwing their claims in with one of the two efforts.
Do you think that any of these legal structures have any bite to them?
That's the $1 million question. I think the Artemis Accords, I mean, it's not a legal structure, right? There's nothing binding about it. It's really just like a set of guidelines about responsible use of space. And I think at this point, it really seems like countries are, signing on with the thought that someday this will be a useful venue to kind of talk about stuff in space. And I think, again, this is something, Jack has covered the Chinese moon base mission a lot. I think there's a lot of questions about kind of the funding of this and the tech of this, and if it becomes a reality. China obviously has the benefit of, not having a Congress that's going to restrict funding or change missions every couple of years. So in some ways they have some advantages, but especially partnering with Russia, whose space industry we've seen not do great lately. I think there's a lot of questions about when and if that's going to happen.
Yeah. So let's talk orbital debris. There's been a lot of action there, and I know, Rachel, you've done a lot of work within the debris space as well. And Jacqueline, I know you spend a lot of time there on the policy side. So let's talk orbital debris. What are some things that you guys have been covering that you think are the big stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really kind of the topic
like Rachel and I bonded over orbital debris.
We really did. Yeah, I did a deep dive that I think, I can't remember when it finished publishing. It was earlier this year or late last year, going into kind of the details of the regulatory environment. And, at the time, there were kind of very few regulations governing what happens in space, whether it comes to disposing of satellites at the end of their lives, or who is in charge when it comes to maneuvering out of the way of another satellite if you're going to, if you're on a collision course. And there's been a lot of movement in that this year on both, I think, the policy and the technology side. There were new guidelines. I don't know the specifics of it, Jacqueline, but at the World Economic Forum, they put forth new guidelines for maneuvering, and the Orbits Act also passed in, I want to say, the Senate a few months ago, and I think we're still waiting on the House for that. But there are new rules in the works. I think the FCC and FAA have also been hammering out some guidelines on deorbiting and maneuvering and things like that. So there's been a lot of movement this year. Jacqueline, I don't know if you have any more specific rules that have been set.
I think probably the biggest thing this year was the FCC actually issued a fine to a satellite operator for leaving their satellite in orbit and not following their remediation plan. And I can't remember how much it was, but like in the grand scheme of things for one of these big companies, like it wasn't a huge fine, but it is so hugely symbolic that, an agency is actually enforcing these things and caring about satellites left in orbit. So I think a lot of people in sort of the space sustainability community saw that as a hugely positive sign that the government is going to take, a more active role in policing space and making sure that companies do clean up after themselves. So that was like a pretty significant first this year, in addition to the legislation and the guidelines that Rachel mentioned.
What do you guys make of all the space tugs, the in-orbit servicing and deorbiting companies that have been funded over the last couple of years? Do you see that as like a growing into a big market?
I have an addendum to that question, which is yes, growing into a big market, but also like there are a number of, like Jack said, companies that are focused on this, but like can these companies ultimately succeed without a real regulatory regime around debris removal?
From what I've heard from these companies is that people are not, or these companies, which there's a host of them, maybe a dozen of them, are not waiting on the regulatory business model, and are focusing more now on life extension and in-orbit servicing rather than deorbiting. And I think there is these they're $1 million satellites that if something goes wrong, or if they run out of fuel or need more whatever they need, to go up and service them is an interesting market.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating market. I definitely do think that it will be growing into a major sector in the coming years. But I agree. I think that the commercial business case is going to be for life extension. For if you can fix up a spacecraft, if you can refuel it, that is going to be, if it is cheaper than sending up a new satellite, I think that's going to be attractive to a lot of commercial customers. On the active debris removal side, I don't really see at this point a business case for that on the commercial side, in the absence of new regulatory structures. But I do think that is something that the US government and global governments are very interested in funding and paying for, because the orbital environment is, it's a commons. It's not something where you can draw a national border and say, within this area you have to act in a certain way. It's something that you have to, if there's a big piece of debris created by one entity, one country, that piece of debris threatens everything else in its neighborhood in orbit. And so I think that is something that governments are going to be willing and ready to pay for. And you see in the US, the DoD through its Orbital Prime initiative is funding the development of active debris removal technology. I think there's also been a lot of funding from Japan this year. The EU has funded debris removal R&D, and I do believe that is going to be something that governments continue to fund, at least for the near future. In the absence of having to pay for active debris removal technology on the commercial side anyway, I don't really see that happening.
What do you guys think about the Kessler Syndrome? So this idea that one satellite will hit another and it'll create this like massive chain reaction, and all of a sudden we'll have huge debris fields in space and it'll be unusable and we'll never be able to do anything, right? That's an extreme, feels like an extreme theory, but there are definitely folks out there that believe in the idea of the Kessler Syndrome. And it logically makes sense in terms of like, if you have a lot of things up in orbit and, could see a chain reaction. But maybe Rachel, since you've done so much of the work and have spent time on the science side of things, like what do you think? Do you think the Kessler Syndrome is real, or is space just so big that it doesn't really matter, at least for the foreseeable future?
Oh, real, I think, absolutely. I think it's something, I mean, like the bigger the piece of debris that explodes in orbit, the more pieces it goes into. And even like a tiny, chip of paint floating around in space that you can barely even see, or potentially not even be able to see at all on ground-based sensors. Even something super, super tiny can cause a lot of damage. We saw it, unconfirmed exactly how this happened, but there were several leaks sprung on the ISS this year due to micro debris impacts. These tiny, tiny pieces of debris can have huge implications. And it's a whole lot easier to get rid of something big from orbit when you're talking about active debris removal. It's a lot easier to grab onto a great big spacecraft that's floating around than to try to pick up the pieces after it's crashed into something and broken apart. I think Kessler Syndrome, isn't necessarily, I don't think it's like the next big spacecraft that breaks up in orbit is going to render all of space unusable. I don't think anyone really thinks that's what is about to happen. But space is about to get a lot more busy. We're launching, tens of thousands of satellites in the next decade, potentially. And those satellites are going to have rules of the road to avoid collisions, to prevent this kind of uncontrollable mess of the Kessler Syndrome from actually happening.
Yeah. So all fair points. So, the last thing I wanted to ask you guys about is, what I think feels like a very big piece of news, which was the House passed the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. The bill is now going to go to the president for signature. So that's about $840 billion for DoD programs, of which $30 billion is authorized for the Space Force. Now, what I find interesting about that is that the NASA proposal is $27 billion. So Space Force has a $3 billion, a $3 billion additional budget, right? So $30 billion, of which 60% is basically going into R&D. So what do you think? What's going on? Why does the Space Force have a bigger budget than NASA?
I don't think this is a huge surprise at all. I mean, defense budgets have always been the ones to balloon. They always have, a lot of champions on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle. I think a lot of legislators aren't as into NASA. I think obviously there are parochial concerns with space too, but in terms of defense, people have like service members living in their district and bases in their district, and competition with China, but not in terms of like who's going to reach the moon first, right? In terms of like national security. So I mean, we've always seen that like defense budgets get raised while everything else gets cut. So it's not a huge surprise, but it does really highlight a lot of the national security threats in orbit. Things like ASAT, but also things like cyber attacks. And there's a lot that can happen and a lot of critical stuff in orbit. So I think it shows, that lawmakers are obviously placing a priority on that, but the defense budget always gets a lot of love.
Yeah, the NASA budget, I don't know the exact numbers. It's probably like a third of the NASA budget goes into the Artemis program. And NASA spent $100 billion on the Artemis program, and we get OIG and GAL reports all the time showing the cost overruns and all the money that has been spent on SLS, which is all fine and good. I actually do think that like as we get closer to the lunar landing, that we might see NASA budgets increase again as that becomes tied a little bit to a quote unquote space race and maybe like national security interest a little bit. But right now there's clearly not, NASA's clearly not getting defunded. But it's plateaued and stagnant, and it's not crazy political in terms of like people don't want to get rid of NASA entirely. But there's been NASA spent a lot of money on things that have they've used a lot of taxpayer dollars that way.
I mean, the Pentagon has never been able to pass an audit, so let's not point fingers about agencies spending money poorly.
That's true.
Yeah, Jack, tread very carefully.
Right.
Okay, so while I have you, I know there's a lot of other things and stories that we could talk about, but we're gonna save that for the newsletter and newsletters this week. I want to talk about predictions for just a bit here, and I would love to hear your guys' predictions on what to expect in 2024. Now that could be trends. You can talk company specifically, and then we can come back in a year and revisit and see who was right. So who wants to start us off? Why don't we go with Jacqueline?
So I have a couple predictions, largely DC based, given that that's kind of the focus of my reporting. We obviously talked a lot about orbital debris. I think we're going to get like actual debris legislation to the president's desk. Maybe I'm giving Congress too much credit, but we have a bill that's passed the House, and there was a space hearing the other day. It was sparsely attended, so again, maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but lawmakers are asking about debris, and the fact that like last Congress the bill was introduced and it went nowhere, and like this past year it passed the Senate, so like the House has a year to take it up. So I could see it getting bundled with a NASA authorization or something, but I think I think we'll see Congress address debris in some way. And I think we'll see the learning period for commercial spaceflight extended. This is something that industry has asked for widely. A NASA official said that they actually don't support it, which might throw a wrench in it. But I think we'll see Congress act early in 2024 to give the commercial human spaceflight industry like a little more time without regulations. And I think those are like my two Congress predictions. So we'll see. As a reporter, it always makes me anxious to make any predictions. Like I want to ask people what they think. It's not our job, but those are my thoughts.
Why do you think next year is the year for debris? Like what makes you say that?
It feels like a lot happened this year. So it feels like maybe it's like reaching a critical mass. And the fact of the matter is that the Orbits Act, which is the bill that the Senate passed, doesn't do a ton. Like it encourages the government to invest in this sort of stuff, invest in active debris removal tech. It encourages the government to, track debris better. But I don't think it's like a hugely costly bill, and it doesn't really have a ton of teeth. So it should be sort of easier to pass. That being said, there's also an election next year, which makes everything harder. They'll be in DC for less time. So we'll see. But the fact that the bill is not like super prescriptive, and the fact that so much did happen this year makes me wonder if next year is the year that we'll actually see something get over the finish line.
All right, then Rachel, you're next. What's your top prediction?
Okay, I have a prediction, and I want to take bets on something. I think that next year we're going to see a lot of movement in on-orbit servicing technology. We touched on it a little bit. But I think that there are a lot of, demonstrations planned, a lot of servicing vehicles that companies are kind of scrambling to get up into orbit in the next year. I think we're going to see more, commercial satellite rendezvous and docking maneuvers. And I think we're going to start seeing the building blocks of a future on-orbit servicing economy really start to get put into place. So that's my prediction for the coming year. But what I want to get your guys' thoughts on is there are 3 lunar landers planned for landing next month. The Slim lunar lander from Japan is currently en route. I think it's targeting landing on the 19th, January 19th. Intuitive Machines and Astrobotic are also currently planning to launch in mid-January. Intuitive Machines, I think, is launching on the 12th, and it has a 7-day timeline, which also would put it on a landing on the 19th. And then Astrobotic's launching a little bit earlier, or targeting a launch a little bit earlier on the debut of Vulcan. January 8th, I think, is the current timeline for that. I want to know what you guys think is going to land first. First commercial landing on the moon.
Well, I would say Slim, and I think it'll be successful. I think all of them are going to be successful.
I love
that's
that.
a lot of optimism.
I think all of them are going to be. I'm very confident all of them are going to be successful. And
I do not think all of them will be successful. There's no chance. I do not think that. I think 1 out of 3 at best is what I would say.
Which one?
But Rachel, to answer your question, I have no idea. Gosh, I really don't know. I would be like picking out of a hat, honestly. I'm gonna go with. I don't know. I'm gonna go with Jack's answer.
well, Slim is en route.
Yeah.
So,
that's my answer too, is because Slim's already been launched, so it doesn't have the messiness that comes along with launch schedules. But that also assumes that Slim will be successful.
Can we do it in that vein of bets? Can we do a human lunar landing and then a Mars lunar landing predictions from the payload team?
Like a timeline?
Like year?
And yeah, like when do we think Artemis will land on the moon?
With humans.
And when do we think we're going to land on Mars? Humans will land on Mars.
I don't know what the current Artemis schedule.
Landing.
I'll go first. I think Artemis is probably, I would say 2028. That's my bet on it. And then I don't know what the Mars windows are, but I would say like 6-7 years after that, we can get to Mars. Humans can get to Mars.
I'm going to say Artemis 2027. I'm going to say Mars 2040.
2040.
I'm less optimistic.
Rachel, you stole my answers. I'm going to say Mars 2040 in a day.
So wait, Jacqueline, you're 2027 for Artemis as well?
That's my bet, because it's supposed to launch at the end of 2024, but it's almost certainly going to be 25. And I think 2 years is a reasonable overrun.
That's not a landing, though. The next Artemis mission isn't a landing.
Oh, no.
It's Artemis 3
right.
is
Artemis
the first
3
landing.
Yeah.
Which adds, another couple of years, maybe.
I'm going to agree with Rachel and say 2027 Artemis. And I'm going to say 2033 for Mars, because that is when we are closest to Mars from an alignment perspective. So if we're going to do it, we got to do it in 2033. So Jacqueline, you're shaking your head, but we shall see.
I think there's no way.
I would love to be proven wrong.
All right. Well, we'll see. Yeah. Yes. I hope Jacqueline is proven wrong as well. All right, Jack, last but not least on predictions.
I would say my prediction for next year is Blue Origin comes in and makes a lot of moves. And I'm going to continue with my optimism, because not optimism is not much fun, but I think New Glenn is going to be successful. And New Glenn is going to Mars on its first launch, or will plan or try to go to Mars on its first launch.
Wait, is that true? New Glenn's first launch is going to Mars?
Yeah.
Like obviously uncrewed, but like going to Mars.
Yeah, it's a NASA payload. That I think they bid like, it's like a $20 million contract, like a really low bid to go to Mars. And it's not like a very expensive NASA payload. So they agreed for that to be, that's what the reporting is now, that's going to be their first launch. And what's going to be interesting is what happens after Vulcan is launched. ULA launches Vulcan. And does that, if it's successful, does that give the green light to potential buyers to come in and finish the ULA auction? And I know Blue Origin is still around that auction.
I'm not going to ask you guys what you think, because that I don't think I should. But what I will ask is, we just did a poll recently on this question. So like, what was the readers' responses on ULA buyer? Didn't we do a poll? Did we not do a poll?
We did a poll a while
It was
ago.
like early 2023. I don't remember the results.
I'll pull it up.
Okay, well, while Jack's pulling that up, I'll give you guys my two predictions for the year. They're actually both SpaceX related. I think that SpaceX will be the most valuable private company in the world next year. Right now, it's number 2, right behind a company called ByteDance, the owner developer of TikTok. So right now, ByteDance I think is worth like $230 billion or $260 or something, and I think it's actually like technically could even be higher because they're doing internal share buyback. So the company's buying back shares, which is two things. One, it helps them elevate their valuation. It may not actually be worth that, but it helps them elevate their valuation. But it also shows that the management and the company itself is very bullish about their own prospects. That's always obviously a really good sign. But I do think that SpaceX is going to be the most valuable company in the world next year. I think they have a lot going for them, and there's just an incredible amount of investor momentum. They just did their tender offer, and they closed it at $180 billion. So it's been just one direction, and of course, as that continues to happen for SpaceX, it's going to have huge positive downstream effects for the rest of the industry. So every time SpaceX is able to notch a higher valuation, I do think ultimately it's going to bring up the entire industry. And then I think the second prediction that I think a lot of people, I get this question a lot, is when will Starlink IPO? And I do not think it is going to be next year. I think it's going to be 2025. I don't know if any of you disagree with any of those predictions, but
I think next year is going to be a very interesting year to see that subscriber growth. And I hope they continue reporting on it. Right now Starlink's at 2 million plus, maybe 2.25 million, but they've grown, they've added 1 million subscribers this year. But can they keep it up? And how big is that market? I'm very interested in that.
Okay. My last question two-part question before I let everyone go. Favorite movie and favorite book, favorite movie / TV show, and then favorite book that has to do with space. It could be science fiction, or it could be science fiction, it could be nonfiction, whatever you guys think. But if you had to, I know, sorry, I didn't mean to catch you guys off guard with this one, but let's start with you, Jack.
Yeah, I'll go with, I love Avatar. I love Avatar, and I've always loved it. I love the just like crazy sceneries in Avatar, and I'm going to consider that a space movie 100%. And then Project Hail Mary, which is the new Andy Weir book.
I'm reading that right now.
Yeah, it's really good.
Okay, good. Yeah. I'm only like one chapter in, but
yeah, it's interesting.
Rachel, how about you?
I think my favorite, I honestly haven't seen a ton of the space movies, the canon, but you put me onto For All Mankind, which I really love, the show.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen the new season yet, but I would say that's up there. And then my favorite book is what I always say is Cosmocomics. It's Italo Calvino short stories.
Jacqueline, last but not least.
So my favorite space TV show is Futurama. I watch it every night, and I slip as many Futurama references into the newsletter as I can, like hoping no one will catch me. I am 100% obsessed with it and have seen the entire series through way too many times to count. I think my favorite book, it's nonfiction, Test Gods by, I think it's Nicholas Schmidl. Maybe I'm messing up his last name. It's about like the test pilots at Virgin, and like he like shadowed one of the guys, but it's also like a very like heartwarming story about his relationship with his own father, and so there's a lot of layers to it. I finished it in like 2 days a couple of years ago when I got a copy. It's a really good one.
Amazing. Well, now that we've given everyone some holiday reading and watch list, I do want to thank you guys for an incredible 2023. It's been really, really fun. You guys have done an amazing job. I'm very excited for another year of Payload, another year of great content from the editorial staff. And this is our last episode of Pathfinder for the year. We will be back next year. We're getting a facelift. There's some changes we're making to the show, both in terms of format and also, well, I shouldn't say anything right now, but what I'll say is that we are getting a facelift. So we're very excited to come back next year with a whole new set of guests and more content and a lot of great conversation. So thank you all. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the editorial staff for joining me. And happy holidays.